It was the war to end all wars. In 1914, catastrophe struck Europe as great power diplomacy failed and alliance systems mobilized vast armies against one another in a conflict that dragged on in bloody stalemate for 4 long years. Nations geared their entire economies towards victory and called up their populations into active service. The intense fighting cost millions of lives and devastated the landscape. British photographers and cameramen were sent to the heart of the action to capture what was happening for the public at home. But this was also the age of modernism in art. Young painters had been rejecting photographic realism for the expression of emotion and the celebration of the machine age. And the government gave artists extraordinary freedom to depict their experience of the conflict. What they encountered, the decimated earth and blasted trees of the trenches, devastated cities, bodies blown to bits, were as fragmented and as deconstructed as the most avant-garde images painted by cubists and futurists in the preceding decade. And those paintings of the Western Front were some of the most shocking and powerful works of art from any period in history. In the summer of 1914, invading German troops advanced through Belgium towards France, leaving death and destruction in their wake. In Britain, the invasion changed public and political opinion. British interests were now under threat, and war was declared. To boost recruitment, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, was given the task of setting up a British war propaganda bureau at Wellington House, led by fellow Liberal MP Charles Masterman. Initially producing posters and literature, in May 1916, Wellington House began mobilizing visual artists to help explain the war to the public, to encourage the United States to enter the conflict, and to keep Britain's cultural life going when artistic experiences were few and far between.
In order to win this was going to be a war of entire societies and peoples, the mobilization of the people, the industry, food production. Every aspect had to be steered towards the war effort. They started calling it the home front. And part of that was the government explaining to the people what the war was for, to justify it. Now, the term used at the time was propaganda. And that term got a very bad response in the aftermath of the First World War, and it took on very much the meaning it has today. It wasn't viewed like that at the time. British official propaganda was closer to what today we would call public relations or spin. And generally they did not hide the conditions of the Western Front from their people. The key figure in British official propaganda at this time was a man called Charles Masterman. He had been appointed just after the start of the war to head the first War Propaganda Bureau. And Charles Masterman was a very capable man and a very artistically sensitive man, as was his wife Lucy. They were both patrons of the arts, and they were both believers in the idea of a better tomorrow. So they appoint the first cine newsreel cameraman in the start of 1916. They appoint the first official photographers. And part of that was the decision in the first months of 1916 to appoint the first official war artists. And official war artists, like the cine cameramen, like the photographers, were made honorary officers. They were given a notional rank. They were patriotic people, in the sense of the time, who believed that the war had to be won, but that didn't mean they didn't hate it. They all hated it. They all thought it was an appalling war, but the message that the propagandists were trying to get across to the mass of the people was that this war had to be won, however bad it was, but also increasingly that it had to be commemorated. In particular, that a better world needed to come out of this war and nothing like it should ever be allowed to happen again. So we see the war artists, and Masterman was very strong indeed on the position that these are individuals, they will interpret what they see on the Western Front in their own way. It is no part of his job, and it's no part of the job of the military to try and impose a view of the war on them. They will work in their own way. That is why they have their positions. And one of the ways in which Masterman saw that it would be important to understand the war was through artists. And it seems that the first of the official war artists, Muirhead Bone, who was a successful society artist, approached Masterman rather than the other way around, or put out feelers to that effect.
And so the Scottish etcher and watercolourist Muirhead Bone was sent to the Western Front. By October 1916, Muirhead Bone had produced 150 small, realistic drawings which were reproduced in government publications.
That kind of propaganda component is quite clear in his work. They're quite beautiful black and white drawings of landscapes. They're quite gentle. I think in the First World War we have some of these kind of modernist beginnings coming across Europe and in Britain. And we also have the nature of total war, which is a new experience for most people, and the rise of technology within that kind of experience being so transformational that people, everyone, but also artists, start to say, wow, the tools that we normally use are just not fit for purpose anymore and don't really represent the requirement that we need, don't speak to the requirement of how to interpret the war.
Up until the First World War, war painting in Britain was dominated by the heroic approach of artists such as Richard Caton Woodville, who imagined the events unfolding in France in a grandiose Napoleonic style. But this was not the approach Charles Masterman had in mind. In 1916, the public learned of the abject horror of the 5-month-long Battle of the Somme. More than 1 million men were killed or wounded in one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Its aftermath was vividly captured by William Orpen. A well-established society portrait painter from Ireland, Orpen had been commissioned into the Army Service Corps and reported for clerical duty at London's Kensington Barracks. But he was eager to secure a war artist posting and curry favour with Field Marshal Douglas Haig, who was commanding the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front.
He managed to wrangle lots of letters of introduction, partly through his famous girlfriend, who was so well connected, and managed to spend 2 years in France. He had a driver and a butler and various members of the team that would kind of look after him. And as I said, he was so well connected that he kind of managed to get his way into various kind of general headquarters and things. So he was very well looked after, all things considered, during his stay, which meant he was able to maintain kind of 2 years back and forth out there.
And each day Orpen was driven to sketch Allied troops or German prisoners and record the devastation. He later wrote,
"I had seen nothing but water, shell holes and mud. And now in the summer of 1917 the dreary dismal mud was baked white and pure, dazzling, dazzling white. It was like an enchanted land. But in the place of fairies there were thousands of little white crosses marked unknown British soldier."
William Orpen produced these wonderful exploration kind of works of the landscape, and Dead Germans in a Trench comes really from that time. Sometimes in that series we see a skull, or we see a bone, or we see a cross that's been, planted into the ground by an escaping soldier. Dead Germans in a Trench is perhaps the most starkly observed work from that series. So in that painting you look down into a kind of wattled trench that's we can see is kind of made and dug in a particular way with a particular type of caning.
He's depicted 2 dead and decaying German bodies, several months old, if not older, in the bottom of the trench. That was rare, but it did happen. The British buried all their dead, if they could reach them, as rapidly as possible, as close to the area where they're being killed as possible. The Germans would do that if the corpses started to rot and there was a real health problem.
The military censor was very displeased with this painting because actually one of the censor rules was that you didn't show dead enemy troops or dead Allied troops either, but that you weren't creating these sensationalist pictures that were morally charged. Of course, William Orpen, being the person he was with the kind of connectivity that he had kind of had a bit freer rein to do that. So he did present this picture back at home. And you see the kind of green putrefied flesh, and I think that that relates to this exploration of colour elsewhere in that series. So you've got like vivid blues of the sky, vivid lilacs and pinks of this kind of white baked earth, and then you have this kind of shimmering colour coming off this dead figure that's pretty arresting, actually, looking at the image. Experiences like this, which were, by his account, real life things that happened to him, he did come across this scene. This fed into his eventual war view.
And Orpen is trying to reflect very deliberately. This was something which might happen to anybody fighting in the trenches of the Western Front. Not only might they be killed, but their body might never be found and given proper burial.
And so the focus on the human body here, although it's an enemy soldier, is a very kind of sensitive portrayal of humanity and isn't about what side you're on or what propaganda you're meant to be creating, but is actually about human-to-human experience of kind of visceral trauma.
12 years younger than William Orpen, David Bomberg had also attended London's prestigious Slade School of Fine Art. Unlike Orpen, Bomberg was an audacious and exceptional talent.
David Bomberg was an established artist when the First World War broke out, and he was influenced by Cubism and by Futurism. But, as with other people, he volunteered to fight in the war. First of all in the Royal Engineers, and he served on the Western Front, later in the infantry, before being given a commission in 1917 by both the Canadian War Records section and also as a British war artist. One of the best known paintings that he carried out was this one, showing a Canadian tunnelling company.
That painting is showing Canadian tunnellers. It's a fairly accurate representation of a tunnel. Most tunnels weren't as big as that, actually. That's rather a luxurious tunnel. Most of them were only about 3 feet tall. I mean, you'd have to crawl. The whole tunnelling escapade, both sides did it. What you tried to do was tunnel under the enemy's trench, pack it with a whole lot of explosives and blow it up.
Bomberg received a commission from the Canadian government to record a particular action carried out by Canadian sappers tunnelling under Saint-Éloi in 1916 to plant explosives under the enemy trench.
This work is a sketch, a kind of preparatory study for a work that became the Canadian Government Commission about this subject. In fact, this version was rejected, and he was asked to tone down the abstraction in his work because, essentially, I think because the Canadian government wanted something more representational and direct. So his language of kind of jagged shapes and interrupted lines and kind of bodies as cogs within this machine and this kind of confusing picture of lines, although it's an incredibly interesting artistic moment, is perhaps not what they were looking for. But you can see Bomberg all the time pushing the artistic envelope in his work. So he's, as well as meditating on the events the Royal Engineers were engaged with, he's also meditating on which artistic language can I use to really fulfill the way I felt about the environment, the intensity of that space, the extreme nature of that piece of work. I can't really even imagine what it's like to dig a tunnel in that sort of set of conditions. It must be pretty terrifying, I would think. And so trying to kind of express that emotional sense through creating these really unusual shapes, lines and angles is I think, absolutely synonymous with his work.
David Bomberg's mentor, Wyndham Lewis, was the most committed and the most radical of all the British artists inspired by the new trends in modern art coming from across the Channel. He was intrigued by the fractured forms and multiple planes of the cubism of Picasso and Braque. But for Wyndham Lewis, the work of Italian futurists was even more dynamic and alive. Rejecting the academic depiction of landscape and the human body, Wyndham Lewis and his vorticist friends set out to celebrate the mechanized modern world. When war broke out, the vorticists hoped it would destroy outdated ways of doing things, but they soon came to see the true horror of the conflict firsthand. Wyndham Lewis was posted to the Western Front and served as a second lieutenant in the Royal Artillery. For much of the time, Wyndham Lewis was in forward observation posts, looking down at apparently deserted German lines, registering targets, and calling down fire from batteries. It was perilous work. Wyndham Lewis actively participated in the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele. In his memoir of the Great War, he described being at the centre of the salient.
Shell after shell pounded down without intermission upon the central artery of the battlefield. Its crushing shells were just troublesome thunderbolts.
A battery shelled is one of the large format canvases we have. It's quite a scene to behold. It's, very, very vivid. It's, lots of colour and shape. So we see these soldiers in charge on the left-hand side of the canvas, and they are surveying the scene of perhaps more junior soldiers working the battery post, as we can see it being shelled and as we can see kind of smoke rising and things on fire and, shapes in the distance that obviously means something is going on.
Now, the artillery of the First World War, in almost all cases, were very large guns, machines. You can see that gun depicted at the back in the centre of the painting. It's actually very hard to see that it is a gun when you first look at it, but it's actually firing, depicted in this particular style, with a large gun shield behind which the men hide, and then the barrel stretching out at about 45 degrees up to the sky, with the blast coming out the edge of the barrel. And guns like these, the heavy guns and howitzers, would have ranges of miles, characteristically between, say, 5, 10, 15 miles, and that meant they could be based 5 miles or more behind the frontline trenches. The gunners didn't have to see what they were aiming at. It's a very obvious analogy. It's often said you will see the men scatter like ants, which is exactly what he's depicting there. These men are running for their lives.
As well as the mechanics of the painting and the colours and shapes, one of the most interesting aspects is the kind of cool detachment in the faces of the more senior soldiers. So though you can see these kind of ant-like shapes scrabbling around on this sort of pile of chaos, they don't look like anything's going on. They look as though they're completely detached. And I think that probably Wyndham Lewis is meditating on the ways in which war just beats that out of you. It beats like the emotional connection out of you and leaves people, traumatised and empty of their normal state.
Wyndham Lewis, along with David Bomberg, William Orpen, and a number of the other war artists, were all taught at the Slade School by the most renowned and formidable teacher of his generation, Henry Tonks. He was commissioned to paint an advanced dressing station in France, 1918.
Well, Henry Tonks was a really extraordinary man. He was a bit older than most of the official war artists. And before the First World War, although he was an established artist, he'd actually followed a second career at which he was equally well established. He was a qualified and experienced surgeon. So at the start of the First World War, he volunteered, first of all, as an orderly with a Red Cross hospital, which means he volunteered for the Red Cross. And then he was given a commission in the Royal Army Medical Corps, allowing him to continue his work as a doctor. And then, when appointed as an official war artist, his painting reflects his own considerable experience working as an officer of the Royal Army Medical Corps in what's called an advanced dressing station.
Now, the advanced dressing stations, they might be in tents. They would usually try to put them in buildings, in villages, to give them cover and security and that sort of thing. So the wounded would go back to them. There again, they could do things like they could splint, they could give a blood transfusion, they could bandage people up, they could sew stitch wounds and that sort of thing.
You can see kind of medical orderlies attending to bodies around the place. You've got some kind of disused building in the background and activity and smoke going on around. So it's clearly, outdoors, we're on a battlefield, there's various people coming in and going out. It's about representing that kind of chaos, emergency, and at the same time order of British medical operations in a combat zone. Tonks was a really interesting artist, I think, because he made use of his kind of medical training and his background as a surgeon in taking down in detail the kinds of injuries that people were experiencing. So we see that in this, what is essentially quite a kind of classical scene with this sort of ruined church in the background and bodies in front. It could almost be a kind of evocation of a classical battle painting, or it's almost like Greco-Roman in its format. But actually, in the minutiae of what he's recording about, medical attention to detail or the extent of injuries or what they look like, actually he's a pretty reliable source because he was able to draw on his background as a medically trained person. He himself also, participated in medical services in combat. So he's there in France partly because he's with the Royal Army Medical Corps as a kind of attached medic as well as an artist.
Another of Tonks's outstanding Slade students was C.R.W. Nevinson, who, rejecting artistic convention, embraced the political ideology and stylistic approach of Italian futurists. When war broke out, Nevinson joined the Friends Ambulance Unit, but was deeply disturbed by his work tending wounded French and British soldiers. When ill health forced him to return to Britain, Nevinson volunteered with the Royal Army Medical Corps and created dynamic images such as the pastel drawing Marching Men, where he mixed his experiences and imagination with the machine aesthetic of futurism.
These are French soldiers marching, done in his particular style, but they're marching in the uniforms that the French army wore when the war broke out. Pretty much every other army involved had by 1914 realised that the power of the weapons was such that some kind of camouflage was necessary.
Christopher Nevinson's Marching Men is amongst the most stylised of the works that exist from this period. You have this very kind of angular, directional format and, very vivid colours, red, blue, to evoke a sort of sense of dynamism and movement, I think, in the scene. Nevinson was a very unusual artist, and he was very committed to modernist language at this period. So he goes into the war effort with a really clear sense of pushing the kind of artistic boundaries and pushing his style forward. So this idea that we are looking at a future that's reliant on machines and isn't that exciting, and those sorts of ideas are definitely in here. So we've got this joined, kind of connected unity of bodies that kind of create one mass, and they're all kind of moving towards the unknown, out of shot, but they're moving in one committed direction. And I think that, they don't really have individual agency within that image. And that's celebrated in this image. And I think he was in the business of saying, it doesn't really matter about you as an individual, you are part of a machine, we are heading towards that brave new world.
In 1917, Nevinson returned to the Western Front as an official war artist, visiting observation posts and artillery batteries. Rejecting his earlier futuristic style, he turned his attention to realistically portraying individuals, either as heroes or victims. On one trip, he sketched a line of walking wounded and prisoners, which became the basis of The Harvest of Battle, his commission for the Hall of Remembrance. It was Nevinson's largest ever single work, and one that saw him reject his earlier leanings towards futurism.
This is Nevinson's Harvest of Battle, depicting the state of the Passchendaele battlefield. The battlefield is shapeless. It's been turned into, in most places, a bog with only small areas which are not free from mud, but at least you can walk through them. And those shell holes, it can be seen, have carved out deep, deep, waterlogged pits. These things are meters deep. People can drown in them, and frequently did. And Nevinson depicts this with considerable accuracy. This is men actually walking with a purpose, but the purpose has been lost. It's almost people who have lost their way in a futuristic landscape in the science fiction and science horror sense, which was the battlefield of Passchendaele at that time.
John Nash was another painter that left eyewitness accounts of the devastation caused by the war on the Western Front. He served as a sergeant at Passchendaele and at the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, a British attack which was followed by the biggest German counterattack since 1914. In Over the Top, Nash provided one of the first hand-painted accounts of a clearly identifiable and for the British devastating action at Welsh Ridge near Cambrai. Nash later described the experience as pure murder and said that he was lucky to escape untouched.
This is the German counterattack where the British are trying to hold on to the ground they've taken, and this was a massacre. They attacked in the snow. This is December. They're moving out without artillery support. The artillery was absolutely critical, but essentially it was thought that if they did this quickly enough, they might be able to do it and take back a trench that the Germans had captured. They were hit by German artillery. Out of 80 men involved, only 12 survived without being either killed or wounded, and Nevinson was one of them. He is depicting this attack that he took part in as a commemoration of what was for him a disaster and a massacre.
We also have a sense that this could be any day of the war, and I think he included that aspect too, that this is about what it feels like to live and be in a typical environment of war. So though it's a specific moment, it's also a general view into the combat experience. I think what's so marked about it and why it's so powerful is that you have this faceless quality to the soldiers that we see. There's a sense that they're just driving on through this hostile weather, this hostile terrain, into what could be impending death. And there's just this unknown force of war driving them up and over the top. And I think that that's where the war artist's work is so important in terms of us understanding the First World War, that though there's nothing that really upset the censor here, it's perhaps one of the most profound images of it must have been terrible to exist in that environment, and in no way does this really boost morale back at home.
John Nash painted Over the Top in a peaceful Buckinghamshire studio he shared with his older brother Paul. At the same time, Paul was creating a monumental work for the Hall of Remembrance. The Menin Road shows a dismembered tract of country in the district dubbed Tower Hamlets, perhaps the most dreaded and disastrous locality of any area in any of the theatres of war.
Menin Road before the war was a main route from Ypres running east to Menin. When it left the Ypres salient, when the British were holding the Ypres salient, then the area at the edge of the salient on the Menin Road, people called it Hellfire Corner, which is a lovely sort of dramatic term, because if you ventured out along the Menin Road, somebody shelled you.
Paul Nash was critical about the war and very serious about painting the Menin Road. He planned to give it
all I can muster to rob war of the last seed of glory, the last shine of glamour.
He didn't want to produce a commemorative work that was about wonderful sacrifice, that was about heroic ideals, that was about national pride or heroism. He wanted to produce a work that was about the damage that had been inflicted on each other and on the environment.
The devastation of the Flanders landscape around Ypres was also captured, but in a less avant-garde vein, by the Brighton-based art teacher Louis John Ginnett, a soldier on active service, given leave to sketch off-duty.
There are several flooded shell holes, the trench lines and bits of broken ladder, things suggesting that people have been there performing their war activities. The landscape is certainly devastated. There are no trees really. There's churned up mud, there's no greenery. We don't have any people in this landscape, we can't see anyone. You know, it's almost like it's a kind of meditation on what we've done to the world, what we've done to this landscape. We've deleted the human quality from it and we've destroyed it. But we still have this morning sky that rises above it. This sort of clarity that Ginnett creates draws our attention to the beautiful peace of the earth despite all of the carnage that has gone on as part of the war.
At the other end of the professional spectrum from Ginnett was the successful American expat society portraitist John Singer Sargent. He was approached directly by the Prime Minister to create a monumental 20-foot by 7-foot canvas for the planned Hall of Remembrance. Sargent had been in America and remained relatively detached from the brutality of the war until his niece was killed in the shelling of a parish church on Good Friday 1918.
Now, he didn't really have experience of the Western Front up to that point. So he went out with Henry Tonks, who was, after all, a medical expert, in August 1918, trying to look for something which would encapsulate an aspect of the war. His actual brief was to look for something depicting Anglo-American cooperation within the context of the Hall of Remembrance.
So Henry Tonks and Singer Sargent were sort of going around together, and Tonks writes home and says, we were looking at the medical stations and he came across this scene and I know he's going to paint it. And it was a mustard gas attack when some troops arrived and they were kind of being led across the scene by a medical orderly.
The standard operating procedure was that if you were gassed and you did not have your gas mask on in time, then you took your fresh field dressing, which was a bandage that every soldier carried in the thigh pocket, you dipped it in water and you tied it round your eyes, because prolonged exposure to gas could cause blindness, particularly mustard gas. So those chaps that are going along that haven't been blinded, that's what they're doing.
So I think that there is an element of realism in this work. I think we can say that it is based on a kind of real life experience and some testimony that he'd got. But we can also see the kind of level of classical illusion in this. I feel like there's this French revolutionary aspect to this work. It's almost also like a sort of Roman frieze. We've got this kind of group of people moving from left to right. There's this classical illusion in there. So definitely he's adding himself to a kind of group of artists that are very historical and very historically grounded and that are very important in the kind of canon of work that helps us understand conflict right from, antiquity to now. I think that we can say probably the soldiers didn't experience the mustard gas attack, nor the bandaging, nor the being led around in this exact way. But I think that, there's a broader point here about how war artists help us reveal broader truth, even if they're not sticking to the exact authentic facts of the scene before them. What they're saying is this happened, and this is what it means. This is the level of impact that we're actually dealing with here. And they help us kind of lift our sense of what this event was to what it means for our society, what we're doing to each other, how profound this experience is. This is at the scale of the French Revolution or Roman conflict. This is about transformation or change. And I think that that's why the image is so enduring and so iconic.
While servicemen stumbled home blinded by this most destructive of conflicts, the British artists of the First World War, previously champions of the modern age, had their eyes opened. In addition to the millions of lives lost and the war's ongoing economic and social repercussions, a curtain had come down on the intense artistic ferment of the pre-war years. The brightest exponents of modernism had their outlook and their visual language changed by the devastation they witnessed. For some, it led to their rejection of celebrating the possibilities of the machine age. They were now aware of the destructive potential of technology. Paul Nash said,
"The whole savour of my living and the nature of my work seems directly affected."
For every major war that's been fought, there's an aspect of it of the remembrance. This is one of the ways in which we identify the big wars, the world wars, the traumatic wars, the wars which leave behind a legacy which affects culture and which affects art.
The war artists from the First World War have perhaps been the most significant cornerstone in how we understand the First World War today. The decision of the government to include war artists, photographers, as well as poets and writers in the collective meaning making around the First World War is the most fundamental decision that could have been made about how we remember the war today. And I think we can say as well that cultural commentators and producers since then, so artists, filmmakers and so on, since that time have drawn on that body of evidence to make their own interpretations and contributions to that remembrance. So they made a really significant contribution in terms of both how we see, how we culturally represent and how we memorialise the First World War.